Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome back to episode 11 of the Bad Eye Podcast. We are back after a short break this week and happy to be with you. I'm your host, Andrew, here this week hosting the podcast at the very end of the alt left pipeline, the only pipeline no government wants to buy for some reason. We are joined again this week by our most illustrious and first three-time guest host, Patricia. For those of you joining us for the first time this week, Patricia is a friend of and now frequent contributor on the show, an Inuk born in St. John's, Newfoundland, and currently a PhD candidate in history on the Dakota and Ojibwe homelands that you may know as Minneapolis. So everyone individually start clapping where you are when you're listening to this and give her a geographically and temporally distributed round of applause.
Thank you. Pew, 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 pew.
Fully support reggae air horns at all times. We're gonna be doing a retrospective on the election we covered last episode. So if you haven't heard, if you live under a rock or outside of Canada, or I feel like Americans heard a lot about this election actually, but maybe you're European for whatever reason. Mark Carney is our new / old prime minister because he was the prime minister before this for a month. We liked him so much we elected him once, but we appointed him twice. Although he only won a minority government. So if you're, maybe for the listeners who are not familiar with the Canadian, system, we do not, unlike in the United States, we don't elect a president. First of all, we have a prime minister and they are appointed by the parties. We vote for our individual members of parliament in ridings that are kind of broken up in the way that most electoral districts are broken up in other democratic states. But the difference is that you're kind of voting for a local representative who belongs to a party, and then the party appoints the prime minister, and they are the functional head of the government. So there are 343 seats in total, of which in this election, 169 were won by the Liberal Party. 172 is the threshold for a majority government, which would mean that they control the majority of the seats in the House of Commons and are therefore better positioned to enact legislation without having to ask anybody else about it. So they're almost there, but not quite there. 143 seats went to the Conservative Party. 23 seats went to the Bloc Québécois, who, if you were listening last episode, you will know is the kind of quasi-separatist Quebec focused party that don't run candidates outside of Quebec. 7 seats to the NDP, boo, down from 24 or 25, I believe, was the previous total, and 1 Green seat. So those are the results.
To be fair, the Greens lost 50% of their seats, which is
I
more
mean,
proportionally than the NDP lost.
no one is talking about the collapse of the Green Party. I mean, nobody is. I've seen exactly 0 articles about that, which I think is unfair because they did proportionally much worse. But yeah, I think that's probably the first thing that we're going to get into this week is talking about, like this definitely could have gone worse. There could have been a conservative government.
Oh, for sure.
That would have been worse than what we got. I'm not, the most thrilled about the results, but I definitely think that I mean, I certainly this is unfortunate to say, but I wasn't expecting Jagmeet to win. I don't think most people were. We've never had an NDP prime minister. It would be great if he did win. But I think that if we're being realistic about it, the polls, we had known months in advance that it was very unlikely that he was going to be prime minister. I don't think that we anticipated that the NDP would, lose as many seats as they did and would lose official party status. Although we were kind of projecting that they might take some losses. But yeah, I mean, this definitely could have been worse. We could have gotten no NDP seats, which would have been,
Real
also a
bad.
less ideal situation than the current situation. But yeah, I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about what we think happened there, and maybe where we go from here. As left leaning people who generally are more ideologically aligned with the NDP to see what we can do outside of government to advocate for the causes that we believe in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to consider, I think one thing that we should look at the the supply and confidence agreement that the NDP signed, and the NDP got a lot of flack for it. I mean, Canada is a pretty young country, and also is relatively new to this whole minority parliament game, which really only started in our lifetime. Um, there were a couple minority parliaments here and there during the 20th century, but I think the majority of parliamentary sittings in the 21st century have been minority governments. And I don't think that the political education or political dialogue in Canada has caught up to that in some ways because, for example, as you mentioned, the Liberals are only truly a handful of seats away from a majority government, three.
Yeah.
And the NDP have seven. And so that means that the NDP could hold the balance of power even if they didn't even though they lost a lot of seats in this election, right? And so on the one hand, people I saw online, and to what extent is my Facebook feed an accurate distribution of boomer thoughts? Unclear, but people saying things like, "Oh, they're basically liberals," or "They're the same as the liberals now," because especially that generation grew up when there were still basically only majority governments.
Right.
And so I also think, though, that there are some good critiques of that supply and confidence agreement. Obviously, I'm very pro people's teeth being in their mouths, and because the ND part of that agreement was to support the NDP's plan for dental care. There's also limited pharmacare that was included in that, so things like insulin, birth control. I think we have other organs that might also need medication, but again,
Yeah. Pro
still
teeth, pro
better.
organs. Yeah.
Pro teeth, pro organs, right? And
That's
so,
and
if
it
we
does seem, just real quick, it does seem like the liberal government is going to make good on that promise, at least with respect to dental. Like we've already been talking about that, we've been hearing about that in the news. So it seems like that's not going to be something that they're immediately reneging on. So there's at least that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that even though um, even though Jagmeet ultimately lost his seat and is no longer the leader of the NDP, that he has a pretty solid political legacy in Canadian politics. I would say, given that he successfully expanded access to public health care for the first time in a very long time. I
Yeah.
actually can't remember the last time the scope of the Canadian medical system expanded this way. Um, and then the other thing I wanted to point out is Jesse Klein, who's a columnist for the National Post, he put out an opinion column basically ragging on Jagmeet Singh, saying yo, he played himself. What if he had voted no confidence? Then maybe the Canadian people would have still voted for him. He lost his power, and that ultimately is true. Jagmeet literally lost his seat, but Jagmeet also, because remember that final vote of no confidence that the Conservatives called before the holiday break in December, Donald Trump was president elect. So we
Yeah.
didn't know what Trump was gonna do, but Jagmeet was also a member of parliament for all of Trump version 1.0. And so I think that if we had gone to an election in February or January or over the Christmas break, then we would have a Prime Minister Poilievre right now. And
Yeah.
so as much as you know, I think that there are very real critiques of Jagmeet's leadership and, of some of the internal governance of the NDP and, a failure to push harder on a lot of issues. At the same time, I also think that ultimately Jagmeet might be who saved us from Polyev for now.
Yeah. I 100% agree. Like I have a lot of specific issues with the way that this campaign was run. And I think that like there are decisions like I was fully supportive of him backing the original liberal government because the liberals were down like some it was like 30 points. It was a ridiculous percentage that they were down. You know, largely due to the fact that people fucking hate Justin Trudeau for many reasons, some legitimate, some illegitimate. Um, and it was the right move at that time to not force an election because the conservative government would have won. And even if the NDP had been the official opposition, even if they had kept all the seats that they actually had, and it was the liberals who just got wiped by the conservatives, like the Conservative Party would have won a majority government, first of all. And wouldn't have had to concede or share power with the NDP. So realistically, like in terms of both what he did for his party and for the country, from my perspective as somebody who does not support the conservative agenda, like I, I think it was absolutely the right decision. You know, we could talk about like, I mean, there's the legality of like, so unlike in America, where if you're listening to this from America, like in America, politicians can kind of campaign whenever,
all the
whether it's
time.
officially or unofficially. Like they start campaigning the day that they get elected. They're campaigning for their next election. In Canada, we have designated campaigning periods, and so whether it's by convention or by actual regulation, like generally politicians don't campaign outside of those windows. I think that you know to the extent to which he was allowed, what he should have been doing is forcefully making the case for himself and for the NDP as a prime minister from the point at which he supported that like gave the vote of confidence for the government. Um, and I think that like a failure that I see in terms of the direction that the NDP went is they didn't really do that. They continue to govern, which is great because we need a functional government. We need government to actually do stuff. But I think that and to be fair, I don't know the degree to which he would have been allowed to do that, but I think that there would have been ways in which he could have been making his case in a more obvious and more transparent way. That would have, and to be fair, I also think this was true of Trudeau. Like it was insane to me that Trudeau weathered that storm, and maybe he knew at that time already that he was planning to resign, and so it was going to be someone else's problem anyway. But like both of those parties should have been immediately in winning public trust and winning public confidence mode in a way that I think that they kind of both dropped the ball on. And
Yeah, and I think this like also comes back to that supply and confidence agreement and the political education side of things because um I don't think that the NDP does enough social organizing between elections. And so, for example, like doing town halls in larger, like, I mean, I don't imagine it would have been economical or possible for them to do like a tour of all of the ridings in Canada to do like town halls about the supply and confidence agreement, but like doing more on the ground kind of not campaigning necessarily, but like that's because that's a distinction I think that's also made in the US because like in the US there are so many weird like foundations and like
yeah,
super PACs and this and that, and so there are all these like there are way more NGOs that exist that do issue based campaigns and that kind of stuff. And so in Canada, there's like, we often talk about like the journalism void and like the cropping up of news deserts in rural Canada. But I think another way that yeah, another kind of like void we have in Canada is also around like a lack of civil society organizations. Um, and and in as much as that is true, then I think that is somewhat becomes the burden of the NDP as like the most left leaning party um, in our political spectrum to especially since they're the ones who signed like what was like a historic agreement in the literal sense of that word, in that that kind of agreement had never been signed before in Canadian history, to my knowledge. And so that I think it then also puts the onus on them to like have done more explaining to people about like how and why they made that choice. I think part of the other issue that was more so an issue earlier, so like as Polyev starts ramping up his like popularity contest, and he, and people start becoming more and more annoyed with Justin Trudeau. Like the NDP, I think also weren't necessarily ready to actually drop the writ. And that's like an expression in Canada for like when we go to election. And so like part of the issue with the supply and confidence agreement, and part of how those boomers on my Facebook timeline like, conflated the NDP and the Liberals together, for example, is that there wasn't that piece of political education that was happening. Because, like, if, for example, Jagmeet had done, like, at least a tour of, like, let's say, all the capital cities in Canada, or,
Yeah.
like, like all the cities over 750,000 people, or, like, something, right? Then that would have been news. Like, that would have had to be covered, right?
Yeah.
And I think this kind of brings me to another point, like about Jagmeet in general, because he's been leader, I think, for about 8 years now. Like that was like the length of his term, and I think when we look back, I would say, had some issues with the ability to create a consistent presence. And so, there are very memorable moments, like from Jagmeet's tenure as leader. So things like, in his early days, there's the moment where a woman at a random town hall calls him, says that he supports Sharia law in Canada, because there's a conflation with the idea of a turban and Islam somehow. I guess
Which is
because, like,
extra funny because Sikhs are literally religiously forbidden from eating halal meat. Just as a side note, like
oh, that is funny.
yeah, they like actually cannot. They're specifically forbidden from doing it. But
Sure, right? And so, like, but yeah, so I think like that's a situation where this woman was like yelling at
yeah,
him, and he talked her down, and like also put her in her place, in a really skillful way. Um, and so like that's really memorable. Also like a slightly more masculine put down where like he like looked like he was gonna get into fisticuffs with Polyev in the house, where he was like, toe to my face, bro. um yeah, that was funny, but
that was funny. And also for the
yeah.
record, he would wash Pierre Polyev, like
Oh,
just demolish him. I don't know that Jagmeet can fight, but I know that Pierre cannot. Like I just know
exactly.
that in my bones. I'm like he would actually shed tears. It would be really funny.
Yeah,
But
totally. Like instead of that like weird Justin Trudeau boxing match that happened like 10 years ago, I would
yeah,
totally,
I
totally
would pay
pay
money.
instead. Yeah, for the Jagmeet Polyev like
Yeah,
actual, yeah. Um but like yeah, something else that like in terms of maybe why Jagmeet couldn't do or didn't feel safe to do that supplying and confidence tour that I mentioned as a possible idea is during this election campaign. It also came out that the RCMP revealed to Jagmeet in December 2023 that there had been a credible threat to his life. And that was when his wife was pregnant with their second child, and his first daughter was 2 years old. And so like, from my perspective, I also think, like, wow, like, that feels like a pretty good, like, on the one hand, he has publicly said a number of times that he doesn't tolerate bullies. And that is in part, like, how, like, some situations he's ended up in where people have critiqued. So, for example, people have critiqued his response to public, um, I don't know if harassment is the word, but like being yelled at by random
yeah,
strangers. And so like that happened on Parliament Hill last year, and he basically stood up to this person and like got up in their grill a bit, who had called him, I think, like corrupt or something like that. And a journalist asked him like, oh, like it almost looked like you were guys were gonna go to blows. And Jack Wick's response was like, I don't tolerate bullies.
yeah.
And so I can understand, like, from that perspective, why he chose to stay on as leader. But I totally would not have faulted him if he was like, yeah, actually, this isn't worth my life.
Yeah. And I think that, like, I mean, to that point, like one of the things that I think it's undeniable that this negatively impacted, his specific campaign personally and also the NDP overall is that like he was a visibly Sikh, visibly South Asian candidate running at a time when like anti-South Asian racism is like it's wild out there. Like it is
Yeah.
at its absolute peak in Canada right now in a way
Wow.
that like in my lifetime, like
Never
I'm
seen it.
32. We're in our 30s. Like not to date us, but I think I've said that publicly before.
Look, the
But
facts
I've
are facts.
never, yeah, like there was racism when I was a kid. Look, I'm not personally South Asian, but I am brown, and there was definitely racism, directed at me and directed at people who I know are South Asian and at people who are brown generally as a kid. But it was not the way, not as like open or as specific or as like gleeful as it is right now. And there are a lot of reasons why that might be the case, but none of them are legitimate reasons, to be clear. Like it's bullshit and it's disgusting, and I think that it's like a real problem that we're going to have to address as a society, that like we are specifically hating on this group of people simply because there are like a lot of them that have come in recent times. But like it also undeniably had an impact on this election, and like whether or not, like on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, it probably wasn't the best idea to run like a
Yeah.
not only South Asian but like Sikh, like visibly South Asian, and like who wears a turban and who has all these markers of like cultural otherness. On the other hand, in a similar way that Jagmeet does not tolerate bullies, like I also hate that, and I would have criticized him for stepping down for that reason, because fuck those people. Like how dare they run the only South Asian party leader that I think we've ever had.
Only
You know,
racialized party leader we've ever had.
yeah, out of
Oh, sorry, first racialized, and then and because like there was like that weird thing where like I mentioned how the Green Party lost 50% of their seats, and so the person who lost their seat who was their co-leader
oh
was a
yes,
racialized. He was a racialized man. So
he was a
at the
racialized man. That's true.
and I think Anime Paul was who was also a former Green leader. Throwback to that hot second where that happened.
Yeah,
She's a black woman, and
yeah.
so but
So
like
not
yeah,
not the first, but one
no,
of the
Judgment.
only.
Yeah, yeah, and only like of of the like the largest party to have that for
Correct.
sure. Yeah.
And so like in a way there's a part of me that's like, even if he lost, I am glad that he ran, and I'm glad that he didn't compromise on that. And I think maybe he could have spoken to it a little bit more directly. I understand why he didn't, in the same way that like Obama very frequently avoided talking about, like racism against black people in the United States as much as he possibly could. I mean, it is literally impossible to avoid completely, because of the rampant
America.
killing of those people in America, which thankfully is not the case with South Asians here. But well, to the degree that it is in America anyway. But I still think that like he deserves credit for that, first of all, like that he was able to accomplish as much as he did, given that he faced obstacles that like no other party leader has ever had to face. I can literally hear Yves Francois Blanchet being like, I too am a minority, but it doesn't count. It's not the same. Like I like
Oh
the
man.
whole Bloc Québécois is like, but what about us? And no, it's not the same. It's a functionally, meaningfully different thing. So he deserves credit for that. But I do think that that also is a factor that like we can't overlook. In addition to like, he's literally getting death threats. Maybe because of his politics, but I would guess at least an
In
element of
part.
that. Yeah, like I would be shocked to find out that he was like, no, I'm actually fine that he's Indian, I just don't like him politically, and that's why I want him to die. Like I
Right.
don't think that's what happened.
No, definitely not. And then also even like another like tying like a strange bookending of his career as like a front person of Canadian politics. I don't know if you remember this, but like he was grilled in the media when he first got elected about like the Air India bombing.
Yes, I do remember this.
And so for people who aren't familiar, this is like one of the only acts of terrorism that originated in Canada on an airplane, and it was linked to Sikh separatists in India because there is a movement called like the movement for I think Khalistani independence, which is basically creating an independent Sikh Punjab province in India, like Punjab as a country, but
Yeah.
out of the current Punjab province that exists in India. And so one of the things after the election that I did was I used DuckDuckGo as my browser. Highly recommend because it doesn't use AI in its search. When you like internet search, and so when I use Google, I have to always put in dash AI. So if you do that, then you don't get the stupid AI summary at the top of the page, which like the pre AI summary was fine. It was fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't
But
we don't we
on
don't
the other hand,
need
like
it.
what if you wanted to know like what the thing you're Googling wasn't? Like what if you wanted to know the opposite of that thing? Then you would want the AI
Right.
summary because that's what it tells you. It
There.
tells you every
That's
single time the opposite of what you're looking for. But yeah, sorry, go on.
it's okay. So I went on like the DuckDuckGo news search bar and I put in like jug meat, and then literally I sent it to the screenshots to you. It was more than half of the results on DuckDuckGo's news search were related to like clearly propaganda from the government of India being like Khalistani, pro Khalistani terrorist leader Jagmeet Singh loses seat in Canadian election. And I
Which, to
was
be
like,
clear, like I don't think that he's ever specifically said that he's pro Khalistan. Like I don't think that that's
never.
an opinion that he's ever expressed publicly, or well, I mean, I don't know him privately, but like publicly, I don't believe that that's a thing that he's ever said.
No,
Um,
he's literally never said that. And like we just mentioned, he had to start his national political career by distancing himself from a terrorist attack that happened during his childhood.
that's imagine if we asked every Bloc Québécois leader, like, how do you feel about the FLQ? Like, they would lose
Literally.
their minds. They would be like, how dare you inquire about, I gotta
Yeah.
stop doing this accent. It's racist, but it's fine. They put the accent on the wrong syllable. It's very funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's like, that's, first of all, it's beyond the pale. I, but to your point about the Indian government, like, I mean, I don't know the extent to which it was specifically the Indian government and not just like random Indian people that don't like him writing these
Sure.
articles. Like, probably it was a combination of
Little
both.
column A, little column B, you know.
Yeah, but one thing that it made me think of, and like I was briefly comparing him to Barack Obama just now. Like, I was at a family get together before recording this, and we were talking about my grandfather. And my grandfather in his office right now has a tiny, like, next to our photos of like our family and his grandchildren, has a tiny framed photo of Barack Obama, even
Oh,
though
my
my
little
grandfather
heart.
is not a black American. Like, he's an Afro
He's
Caribbean
black.
man. He's
Yeah.
black. He's not American. He's like, he doesn't live in America. He can't vote in America. Not an American citizen. But it was a big deal for him that a black man was able to become the president of the United States. And that kind of support, because, and this is maybe a thing that like blackness unifies people in a way that like Indianness and South Asianness doesn't, because of the unique history of blackness as a
Yeah.
construct outside of like
Africa,
national
yeah.
identity and ethnicity. Like, India doesn't have that particular history. And so the like when we think about like an Indian community, like that's not even really a thing. There are dozens of communities of people who happen to like nationally be from India, but like they are their own separate little ethnic groups. And so like he probably had support from at least some of the Punjabi community in Canada, but there's a substantial number of people who, like, if you don't know anything about South Asia or South Asian politics, you would just kind of assume like, oh yeah, he's Indian, so like all these Indian people are going to support him. That's not really the case. He couldn't he
It's not
didn't
it.
benefit from that like kind of solidarity and support that he would have gotten had he been like an African American candidate in America. Like it's
Yeah.
so that's also a factor in terms of like him not doing as well, the party not doing as well, is like you can't rely in Canada. Well, I mean, not even in Canada, because I think that like if a black person were to run, for a federal well, having said that, we did just talk about the black woman who ran as a part of the Green Party. But if there were like a black leader of a major party, I do think that they would get a kind of solidarity that Jagmeet just didn't experience from, the broader South Asian community, just by virtue of kind of the nature of politics within that community.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to also circle back to something that we had spoken about in our slightly pre-election uh, episode. I know words. Which was I had mentioned that there are cases where strategic voting means that you should vote for the NDP, and I am so upset that I have such a good example of like where this is the case, because it is the riding where my aunt, whose birthday I'm born on her 30th birthday,
Oh, that's
and
nice.
yeah, and my uncle, like on my dad's side, both live in northern Vancouver Island in British Columbia. So, in this riding, which the incumbent is the NDP, former NDP MP, Tennille Johnston, she was defeated by man of the hour, Aaron Gunn. And we can have a little aside about why he is a horrible person after I do the math on this. But so, in terms of what the final standings were, these are all rounded down. So, about 31,000 votes go to Aaron Gunn, about 26,000 votes go to Tennille Johnston, and then 21,000 votes go to the Liberals. The Liberals increased the number of votes they got by 14,000 votes. And so that means, so like, Tennille Johnston only needed like less than 6,000 votes to win that
Yeah.
seat. And so if 6,000 people had not, quote unquote, voted strategically, and now I don't know the liberal candidate Jennifer Lash, like maybe Jen's like real persuasive. I don't know her from Job. But the point is that given how often this idea that quote unquote voting strategically means to vote liberal, it would not surprise me if a significant number of the 14,000 new liberal voters in this North Vancouver Island riding, at least some of them voted liberal because they thought they were voting strategically. And so this like makes me want to like pull my hair out because, especially given the number of seats that the NDP did lose, the fact that this one specifically seems to have been lost to so-called strategic voting, immensely frustrating.
That is incredibly frustrating. And I mean, we can talk specifically about Aaron Gunn, you know, after, but I do want to like make a broader point here, which is like the liberals won this election by running against Donald Trump. Like that is what this election was about. And I think it would be, I mean, one of the things that like this has been making me feel, the aftermath of this election has been making me feel like I've been feeling like people are breathing a sigh of relief in a way that, as when we talk about Aaron Gunn, you'll see like I don't think that we should be like, yeah, this is great. We'll take our wins where we can get them. Like, and this, from a leftist perspective, it's not quite a win, but it's not a loss. It could have gone much worse, as we said before. But I think that, you know, if we learn anything from the American election, like I would compare this to like a Biden 2020, you know, period in time where if we do not play this right, if the liberals do not govern in a way, and we can get into this after we talk about Aaron Gunn, because I think he's a really good illustration of why I'm saying this. Like, if the liberals do not govern in a way that makes people feel like the change that they are looking for is actually happening and like materially improve conditions in their lives, then we are going to end up with a huge backlash. And people like Aaron Gunn, who you are now free to describe at length how fucked up and insane he is, are going to actually take power all over the country. Like, I think that it would be a mistake to assume that like, oh, Mark Carney won. Like we're, we and I've been hearing about this particularly from Americans. Like I've been watching a lot of American coverage of the Canadian election, and the consensus in America is like, oh, Canada roundly rejected Trump and roundly rejected, that brand of conservative politics. And I actually think that that is a huge mistake to read what happened in this election that way, because I think that while that is true, in that like literally the majority of the people who voted liberal, there is a vocal and substantial minority of people who supported this like Trumpian, anti woke, whatever that means, because they can't even define it, brand of conservatism. And those people are not gone. They're not going to go away. And they are people like Aaron Gunn.
Yes. Um, yeah. I think that is really important. And like to, before we get to our friend Aaron, in the United States, like a lot of people, I think, felt as though, um, like Kamala didn't have a clear ideological vision for how to improve things. And some people said, oh, well, it was because, said she was part of the Biden administration, like, she couldn't like go too far in criticizing. And it's like maybe maybe she didn't have to criticize. Maybe she said, well, Biden wanted to go this far, but this is how much further I want to go, right? And so for like because left wing policies are actually popular, and like in America, um, part of the issue is that there's so much corporate money in politics that is something that we actually have pretty good limitations on in Canada.
For
Um,
now.
for now, see how she goes. But and so like that is often one of the things that's credited for why Dems like don't run on policies that are like universally popular. Like things like Medicare for all are popular among Republicans and Democrats, and yet the Democratic Party doesn't run on it as an actual policy. And so, I think, and in some ways, like, that's somewhat, I think, also instructive, like, in a weird roundabout way to the NDP, right? Like, where in this election, like, their actual platform was good. I don't think, like, it got sufficient coverage. But also, like, tying that in earlier, right? And, like, I think one thing that I don't know why politicians don't do more is, like, put through bills they know are going to fail anyway, so that they can like point and say like, look, those people voted against this thing. um yeah, and so like that's, for example, could have been a way for like the NDP to like keep some of their issues in the news maybe. But in any case, I digress. Let us talk about Aaron Gunn. So Aaron Gunn, bit of an odd cat. He so in British Columbia, there is not really a conservative party. There was a Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party was the equivalent of the Conservative Party. Now that party is known as BC United. And so Aaron Gunn attempted to run for the leadership of that party in 2021, but he was disqualified after the party views conflicted with his so the party said that it was committed to things like diversity and reconciliation, which makes a lot of sense in the context of British Columbia, a province with one of the largest indigenous populations and also most multiracial populations in Canada. I
Yeah.
think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the majority of settlers in British Columbia are not white. And so, it makes sense that if you're a political party and you're trying to get elected in the majority of seats, that you actually do need to reflect some of those things. And so, here are some of the things that Aaron Gunn has said about residential schools, which in America are known as boarding schools. He claimed that Indigenous groups in Ontario asked for residential school, that the word genocide did not reflect the reality of the residential school system. In 2020, he tweeted, "There was no genocide. Stop lying to people and read a book." And now, I mean, you could read a book like, for example, Clearing the Plains, which is a book that talks about the strategic use of famine by the federal government in Canada to force people on the prairies into signing treaties. No, why would you read that book when you could say things that, like the following year in 2021, when he described residential schools as much maligned. So it
I,
comes as no.
they are much maligned. That is an accurate way to describe them. They should be maligned. They're worthy of
Right.
malign. They are
I think,
malignant. They are the
yeah,
worst. Like
they actually, like, they're much maligned because they should be.
yeah, they
They
actually
are.
they're much maligned. They are not
They're,
maligned enough. Like
yeah,
they should be
they're at
even
the.
more maligned.
Right, exactly. Like, clearly, if people like Aaron Gunn are out here in the world thinking that if people read books, they will believe in residential schools less, somehow, even though there's many historical texts about them.
Yeah, I just like
Alas.
the ideal number of like children's skeletons that you want to pull out of a schoolyard is
Zero.
zero. There should be none. There
Right.
are many, and that means that it is not maligned enough. Like that's because that's a thing that happens. It's been
Yeah,
happening over the
and
course of the last few
especially
years. Like
and especially since, like, the first set of graves that is found is in the Shuswap in the interior of British Columbia. So, like, that's like in the same province, okay? And
yeah,
so the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, um, like, condemned his statements, like, obviously, and there was even a petition that received over 15,000 signatures for him to be removed as the candidate in the riding that he was eventually elected in. Then, like, Pierre Polyev did one of the weirdest things. He did like a double negative, so he like created fake news by lying. So Polyev says that it was false and misinformation to say that Gunn denied the impact of residential schools. So Gunn didn't actually speak for himself, but like what Polyev said about him was, Gunn has said that he wants to continue to condemn residential schools and build stronger partnerships with First Nations to unlock our resources so we can produce incredible paychecks and opportunities for First Nations communities, which is like a problematic statement in and of itself because it presumes the consent of Indigenous communities and that Indigenous people want to, quote unquote, unlock our resources. I presume that Poilievre is including himself in the word our there, which is like a bit rich, considering that they're First Nations resources. And furthermore, like, even as early as like last fall, Gunn was like producing misinformation videos about this marine protected area that's been collaborated upon by 14 different First Nations in BC. And he called it, I think he said something like it was like kowtowing to the agenda of radical environmentalists. And that this was a unilateral move by Justin Trudeau.
sorry
So,
that you the listeners couldn't hear the stunned silence, so I have to voice it because I can't. I need to like describe in descriptive video format the face that I just made. That's wild. That like
yeah. And I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about this seat, right, is like, yes, okay, like because it's literally like the margin between Gunn and Johnston, so like between the Conservative and the NDP is 5,000 votes, and then the distance between the Liberals and the NDP is also 5,000 votes. And so, one of the things that this shows is actually like it illustrates this phenomenon that does exist of the orange blue voter. And for people like us who are kind of like in the weeds, who like are like a little bit policy wonky or like, interested in the news, like sometimes are confused by these orange blue voters because people think like, well, how could you vote like blue if you had voted orange before? And I think something that really gets underrated about those voters is that at least they obviously they want someone who has an ideology, right? Like who actually has like a set of values or facts or priorities that they're like very clear about, right? Because often like the liberals, they're trying to play the field. I mean, like, you and I had mentioned over text that like Mark Carney would have been a conservative like 25 years ago,
yeah.
and so what the liberals trying to like cut down the middle between like left wing ideas and conservative ideas has in our lifetime really allowed the conservatives to like set a lot more of the agenda. And there's like other factors that go into that, like political consultants from the US being used in Canadian politics and whatnot. But I do also think that it is interesting to consider that, like, for people who don't pay super close attention to politics, and for people who only, like, kind of do politics when elections roll around, that there are a subset of Canadians who just want you to have like a coherent vision instead of
Yeah.
like a wishy-washy, like down the middle approach.
And I don't think that's unique to Canada. Like I mean, there there's a whole bunch of news, in the American elections about, people who supported both AOC and Donald Trump, or both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And like there's definitely an anti-establishment element to that too, where it's just like they will vote for whoever they think is going to make the most radical change, whatever change that is.
Right.
Which, maybe that part doesn't apply as much to the kind of like conservative NDP voter, or maybe it does, but I think there's also, and this is something that we talked about last episode too, and even in the Ontario election episode, like people want politicians who stand for something. And, you know, Aaron Gunn stands apparently for being just a heinous piece of shit, but like he's very open about it. That's a principled position. It's a garbage position, but it's a principled position. He's very consistent, and I think that's also, like why a part of why Poilievre lost is, you know, he doesn't seem that principled. Like he couldn't define what woke was when people were asking him like, oh, you want to do all this like anti woke stuff? What does woke mean to you? He had no way to articulate what that meant to him because he doesn't know what it means because it's a bullshit term. Like people can smell authenticity and they whether or not they're super dialed into policy, whether or not they're super dialed into, the particulars of what candidates are actually promising, they can tell when they're being bullshitted. Bullshat. They can tell when they're being lied to. And they they just like people respond to principled positions, and I think that that's both a way that like because I think in the NDP in this election, like although they did have principled positions, like if you read the NDP platform, it was hard to argue that it wasn't coherent and consistent and aligned with their stated values as a party. But I think they really struggled to communicate that. Like I think that was a campaign failure in this election at least. In the same way that like I think that the liberals, although they kind of lacked a coherent and consistent vision, they were able to articulate a very principled message, which was like, ironically, Canada first, where we're standing up to Donald Trump. And I think probably the NDP should have run against Trump more than they did, in a more direct way than they did. Like I found that like even in the debates, like Jagmeet was kind of talking a lot about the liberal government, and like Mark Carney very rarely mentioned either candidate. He talked specifically to and about Donald Trump and about the moment that we're in, and that spoke to people because people do feel like we're in kind of an unprecedented moment at this time. And I think that in general that kind of cuts across party and ideological lines. Like that's a thing that people respond to more than anything else, more than even policy. Because like if you read the policies, I think that a lot, like we were talking about AI earlier, that his whole like, oh yeah, we're gonna cut the healthcare budget by making it more efficient. We're just gonna use AI with no like real specifics about what at all that means. Like that's a terrible policy. It's not a
What does it
good policy.
mean?
It doesn't mean anything. It's not even a policy. It's just we're gonna use AI and then we're also gonna cut the healthcare budget a bunch and it's gonna work out. It's gonna be fine. It's totally good. But because he was able to articulate, you know, a clear direction and a clear vision, he won. Like it's as simple as that, I
Yeah.
think.
And like going back a little to what you mentioned about like the bullshit tometer related to Polyev, like for me the moment that like is so clearly crystallized was during, because one thing about this election that I will say is a little incredible is that, as much as Jesse Brown from Canadaland has been like going a little cuckoo bananas for the last few years, one thing he has often said about Canadian politics is like, whatever the most boring possible outcome is, that's what will happen. And this election managed to do a both and. It was both that the Liberals won a minority government, which is the most boring possible outcome of this election, but
Sure.
also, like, Polyev lost his seat, which
Yeah.
is wild. And so, what I am getting at with the authenticity thing is like when he gave his speech, his concession speech to Bruce Fanjoy, who has been campaigning, I think, for actually 2 years, to like to come to this victory. And it wasn't a huge, like, it wasn't like a landslide, but it was significant. Like, there's a couple seats in Newfoundland, at least one that was decided by, I think, less than 40 votes, right? So it wasn't a situation like that. And instead, he, like, if when Donald Trump lost, right, it was all the voting machines and, it's rigged and we
Yeah.
need to, da 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 da. Because, like, Donald Trump, for all his flaws, like, does believe. Like, he actually believes a lot of the crazy things that he says. But for
Which is
Polyev,
actually worse, but yes.
no, in some senses, I mean, it's worse. It is worse, but like it is interesting to me that Polyev gave a normal concession speech. Like his concession speech was, "Oh well, we'll have to try again next time, and we'll figure something out." And like, good job, Bruce, and like I look forward to seeing you in Parliament. And to me, like the fact that he didn't go out there and be like, "We need a recount," and like all these different conspiracy theories that were being spread on like TikTok and stuff about like why Elections Canada gives you a pencil is because they erase your vote and like write in yours, and not because a pencil can be sharpened, but pens run out of ink, couldn't possibly be trying to save any money.
Also,
Yeah,
you can tell when someone erased a pen. Like you can always see. I've never seen 100% successful pencil erasing. Like that
yeah,
doesn't. That's
it
not a
turns out
technology we have.
like the pencils don't write in invisible ink, right?
Yeah,
Like, yeah. Anyway,
but
so
yeah,
he like the fact that like he gave this like very normal like concession speech, I was like, right, because you don't actually believe the stuff you say, you're just saying it to get in power, which to me is just like so disgusting because like I think of like in my ideal world, like in Ireland, the way that they wrote their constitution was they took a random 100 people, so they controlled for like gender proportion, like some class variety. Ireland's a pretty homogenous place, but I think they made an effort to like have some racial minorities, like members of the LGBTQ community, and they had lawyers like give them different like sub clauses or sections, and then like the 100 people would debate, and then like they would come to some kind of consensus conclusion, or they would have a vote, and then based on that, the lawyers would go redraft or like put it in. And like that to me is an ideal world because you don't actually want people who are only in it for the power to be in politics. And
yeah,
like that is such a huge contrast between like Jugmeat and Pierre for me because like I said, this guy from the National Post is like, oh, like Jugmeat played himself, like maybe he'd still have a seat. And it's like, yeah, but Jugmeat also knew that like Polyev is a huge threat to like the gains that he has made during his time as leader. And the other thing that I find really interesting and like comes kind of back to this point about like the fact that Canadians don't understand like kind of coalition building, literally, like, I don't mean that in the like big tent approach to activism. I mean like the parliamentary kind.
yeah.
Um,
Actual parliamentary
Actual
coalitions.
parliamentary coalitions, because like a lot of people talk about, oh, Jack Layton was the best leader the NDP had, like people say that all the time. And I think it's easy for people to say that because that's like that's the largest seat count that the NDP got to, but that was in part just because of how pissed Quebec was at everyone. Like
Yeah,
simultaneously a ton of Quebecois people were like, why not the NDP, and
yeah.
is that really a political success? Um, and like not to like obviously I know Jack Layton is like borderline a political saint in Canada, so like I don't need to get too deep down this, but just to say like that when we think about like the concrete outcomes of those two men's political careers, Jagmeet saved Canada from like Polyev being prime minister and rolling back all of the gains that he had made during his time. And like Jack Layton oversaw the largest NDP caucus, but like I actually can't name a lot of specific policies that like Jack Layton has left as a legacy.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment of both of their careers, honestly. Like, and to your point about like your earlier point about Liev just being in it for the power rather than Jagmeet, who I think like you're right, he could have kept his seat, but I don't. I mean, obviously the seat would have been ideal. The prime ministership was the goal, but like I don't think that he was just in it for the power in the way that like Pierre Polyev has been a politician since he was like what, like 20 years old, like some ridiculous. I don't think he's ever had a real job. Like this
No,
was
he's
it for him.
no,
He's
yeah,
like engineered his entire life to be in politics, which I mean, as a side note, like makes it delicious that he lost his seat. And we could talk briefly. I think we'll probably close off with this, but like we'll talk briefly about what's next for him, because I think that one, we deserve a little fun. Fuck him, but also, uh, you know, I think that you're right to say that like it wasn't genuine, and that's both good and bad. Like it's good because like obviously like I don't want him to be I don't want him to be a Trumpian style figure who's like an earnest lunatic who actually wants to be an authoritarian, although not that I think that he wouldn't abuse authoritarian power if it were given to him, but like who earnestly wants to like actively dismantle the government in the way that Donald Trump is doing right now. I also think it's bad because it says something about the state of politics in this country that like one, even a cynical imitation of that is persuasive to people, uh and two, that like they think that it'll work. Like that's toxic and damaging, and like the real agenda behind it, which is like the I mean, as you were talking about, like they're doing woke pipeline building now. They're like, oh yeah, like we want to extract our resources in partnership with the indigenous people or whatever. Like that's the real agenda behind it, is unchecked capital interests that are cynically using this kind of jingoistic, bigoted, general anti progress and progressivism ideology to you know remove any kind of checks on their power. That's really the heart of what it's about, and I actually think that that's much more dangerous than even like an insane authoritarian, because an insane authoritarian movement like that, Donald Trump's whole thing is eventually going to implode, and what he leaves in the wake of that could be worse, honestly, like, but it won't be what is happening right now. A coordinated cynical strategy by competent capital interests who don't care about democracy and don't care about people's human rights and don't care about the environment and don't care about any kind of like anything except for the kind of naked pursuit of profit, that has the potential to sustain itself for a very long time, in a way that I think is much more dangerous.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and that's part of why I like hesitated to be like, is which one is worse?
Yeah.
Because like obviously authoritarianism bad, but like this like level of cynical calculation towards power, like towards power that is seeking to bolster other forms of power, right? So to take political power towards being able to help capital, the power held in capital to bolster itself, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and before and like yeah, I guess like before we take some Schadenfreude with Polyev, like one last kind of NDP point I want to make is that you know when the polls of this election were like actually very accurate in Canada, and so when you look at like our version of like the Nate Silver blog or whatever, I think they got everything right except for the NDP. They did not predict the extent to which the NDP would collapse. And that's because the NDP polled relatively well. And like it was decreased, like it definitely it wasn't the same share of the vote, but like proportionally across the country, like if you compare the proportional population vote, the party that gets screwed the most is the NDP. Because the NDP, in terms of, I think like the number of seats they would have in parliament would double or something. And so, like, one of the things that that polling information says to me is it does speak to the fact that like people actually do like the NDP. Like people like the like NDP ideas, and that makes sense because a lot of the ideas that the NDP have are ones that eventually become core Canadian identity pieces. So, what do Canadians love more than like lording our healthcare system over Americans? Like, even if there are aspects of it that have become dysfunctional due to a failure to support it sufficiently, but the fact that we don't have to pay for our healthcare, like, that's a huge part of like one of the things that makes Canadians not Americans, and that's an NDP thing.
Yeah. What will we have to be smug about without them?
Exactly. And so I think like something that is important for people going forward is like, as I mentioned, in 2000, Mark Carney would have been a conservative. And
Yeah.
so I'm very curious to see, like, he has made a comment to the effect of like his cabinet's going to be have a lot of fresh faces. And so I'm very curious to see which fresh faces end up amongst it. You can't always tell someone's Indigenous by looking at them, so like huge caveat there. But I know of a number of Liberal MPs who were Native who've retired, and also a lot of Native people who are not in politics were like named a number of people inside the Liberal so-called Indigenous caucus as being pretendians. Which
Oh.
is a portmanteau of pretend and Indian. And so like it's interesting to me that it doesn't seem like there's as many native people. They're still yeah, in the Liberal Party, versus like I think of the NDP members that there are, a third of them are native women. um and so that's interesting. But I think that we really need to be on our toes in terms of making sure that we get out and like show our support for particular institutions in Canada, like healthcare, like workers' rights, like the environment, which like didn't come up in the election except for pipelines. And
Yeah.
so like these and like something that we like I think you had brought the point up about like don't get too like worried about like if you're not able to do all the activism, just like pick the thing you're most passionate about. And now that we've moved on from an election time to a post election time, this is the moment where it is like we like go find an issue based volunteer organization. If you can't find one, maybe look into founding one, or like pick your second most important issue. Like for people who have decent paying jobs, but don't necessarily have the time to volunteer, making sure that you're signing up for like a monthly donation to a lobbying organization or a issue based organization that you care about. And remember that like those are all charitable donations, and so you do get like I think up to like 50% of that money back once you file your taxes. And so like if you're giving a $20 donation, you can think of it as actually being a $10 donation and $10 deposited into your savings account, so that when you
Yeah.
go to your taxes, you get your money back.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Actually, on that note, like I know they said we were going to talk about Pierre, but I actually, you know what? I feel like we've talked about Pierre enough. I want to because I think that that's a good segue to talk about. Back when I was talking earlier about how this kind of feels like a Biden 2020 situation. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, and I think that it's like a more opportune time to bring up now, is like what could Mark Carney do? Like, and I'm going to ask your opinion. I'm going to give some thoughts of my own. Like, what could Mark Carney do in order to prevent that situation? Because I talked a little bit about it before, like materially changing people's positions, or sorry, material changing people's material conditions, not positions. Although changing their material conditions will change their positions. Uh, but like, what would you like to see Carney do, and in a way that you think might help to stem the tide of this kind of conservative backlash, because there's a lot of anger right now in the country. There's a lot of, I hesitate to use the term justifiable anger, because like Alberta wants to secede for like really dumb reasons, but like the
Yes, so dumb.
underlying but the underlying grievance behind that movement is an economic one that is valid. Like those people have been kind of captured by this insane ideology where they're like, yeah, we want pipeline ocean access for our landlocked province and all sorts of other dumb demands. But like really what they're feeling is like their lives are not as good as they used to be, and they don't have the economic opportunities that they'd like to have. So like from your perspective, and then I'll talk about some things that I think would be, a good idea. Like what could Mark Carney do that would improve people's material conditions, and that would, at the end of his term, people wouldn't feel like they need to resort to a radical change to kind of blow up the status quo in the way that they did in the United States.
Okay, so one thing is I think that like we need to fuck private public partnerships. They just they don't
Yes,
work.
they are
Like,
so bad.
and so and that's like how a lot of liberal policy related to housing has been attempted. And so I think getting back into the business of government housing, and the other reason why I think it's important for like the federal government to start maybe doing some of that work specifically again, um, is like, due to the fact that there are a number of conservative provincial governments. And so, like, those governments are going to be uncooperative, right? And so, it's in the best interest of Danielle Smith for her reelection for people in Alberta to suffer. Because if people in Alberta are suffering, then she can blame it on Mark Carney and then she can get reelected. And so, also doing things like bypassing provincial governments for municipal governments, perhaps, like when it comes to social housing. Like, one of the reasons why the NDP was running on national rent control was because, like, because the housing crisis is one of the most recognizable universal crises that's like being faced in Canada right now. And I think if you can bring people's housing costs down to like ideally less than 30% of their income, then that unlocks money so that like if groceries or the price of other things are going up, that doesn't hurt as much if the price of housing, which is like, the cornerstone of stability for so many people, for everyone, goes down. And so I think making inroads without compromising to private interest on housing would be huge. I think like the dream would be to, and because this would also be a really smart way to undercut Danielle Smith, specifically in Alberta, is embracing the green transition and making it a just transition. Because, there are tons of workers in the trades in Alberta who think of environmentalism as a direct personal attack.
Yeah,
And so if you're able to reach those people and explain to them that it's not a personal attack, it's an opportunity for a more sustainable career, and maybe one where you can just live in Cape Breton and you don't have to do fly in, fly out, and you get to like
yeah.
actually spend time with your kids every day instead of just, like half the time. Um, then like those I think can make like that would be a huge way to undercut Danielle Smith's cuckoo bananasness.
Oh my gosh, she's
Um,
insane. But yeah, no, I think that's a good
yeah.
point.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think, and even as like a transitional, I mean, maybe you'll disagree with this, but I think as a transitional phase, leading towards that, like a thing that he could do, and I think should do, is nationalize the oil industry. And the reason that I think that he should do that is, well, I mean, there are a few reasons. One is that a great way to win those people over would be to start paying them in the same way that like Norway does, or some other like oil producing nations do, or actually like Saudi Arabia and a lot of other oil producing nations pay their citizens direct dividends out of the profits of the like resources that are extracted. And I think that that would go a long way towards like one, revealing the degree to which the people who are, see, resource extraction as directly tied to their livelihood. Like if they understood how much they were getting screwed by the companies that they actually work for, and the like actual peanuts that they are getting paid, like even as a like winnowing down the oil production that we're doing, because by the way, like the liberal government over the last 10 years has increased oil production by 50%. Like, it's actually insane that they think that
Wow.
there is like an anti-resource extraction agenda. Like, we literally are producing like a full 1.5 times the amount of oil that we were before. But like, even if we were to winnow it down, I think as a part of that process, like, one, if the government has nationalized it and owns it, now they are in control of how much is produced and actually has the power to stop it without, having to fight corporations who are going to fight back. Like, that's a part of it. But also, like, you can use part of the profits of the extractive industry while it's happening to, you know, improve people's material conditions, and then also to reinvest in that green transition. Like, because right now that money is not being, I mean, it is being invested, but it's being invested in more resource extraction. Like, that would be a thing that he could do tomorrow. Well, I mean, it would probably take longer than tomorrow, but that would be a thing he could do immediately. That would He could fund the green transition that way entirely, and then he wouldn't have to, explain. Because as soon as they propose a green transition, everyone says like, "Oh, how are you going to pay for it?" Well, that's a way that you could pay for it. You could take the money that is currently just being used to line the profits of oil executives and their shareholders, and you could distribute some of it to the people writ large, distribute more of it to the people who are actually doing the extraction, and reinvest a substantial amount of it into transitioning out of that industry and to training people who currently work in that industry to work in, the energy sector in more environmentally friendly ways. I think that's one thing that they could do. But yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, in general, I'm like very pro nationalizing things.
Yeah, I think that that would be a step. I mean, it would be a step. It'd be like a one step backwards, two steps forward situation. Like, I think it's
Right.
like, calling it a step in the right direction is kind of a stretch, because like ultimately, like, what I would like to see is no oil coming out of the ground. But I recognize that like that's not realistic in the immediate future. We still need oil. We still need, our economy is still quite dependent on oil. And one way to get our economy to be less dependent on oil is by not allowing a huge portion of it to be captured by these oil companies, and instead to be run by the state in a way that, we can drive it directly towards that goal, rather than like dragging these oil companies kicking and screaming, which is what we're trying to do right now. So that's one thing that I think that they could do.
Yeah, my last thing I'll say on the politics front before we get to our media rex is like I one of the things I think is really important about your recommendation is that it is not American centric in its recommendation. And so I think a huge problem in Canadian politics is that if you're constantly comparing yourself to a literal dumpster fire, like you don't make a lot of progress that way, right?
Yeah,
And so
100%.
and like being willing um to look further afield for innovative policy solutions in places like in different countries in Europe, like looking to like in like so the like Canadian Constitution, like our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is known for being like really strong. In South Africa, like in their constitution, they have like more they have like more economic and social rights than we actually do in Canada. So like for
Oh,
example, they explicitly have a right to clean drinking water. And so for example, like if the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms had like a clause about water in it, then like First Nations reserves might not still have boil water advisories, as many of them still do. Thanks, Trudeau. Yeah, and so I think it is really important that as Canadians, especially since Carney ran on an anti-Trump campaign,
yeah.
that we need to be very clear that preventing us from being America is not good enough. That can't be the baseline. We like need to move past that being our point of comparison, because we all deserve so much better. There's so much wealth in Canada that literally by taxing the hyper wealthy by like 1 or 2 more percent, we could pay for such a great quality of life for everyone.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think I even said that in our first episode. Like, I think that a huge part of our national identity is being like 20% better than America. And I think that like we could do much better than that. Not to shit on because I think America could also do much better than America, but like I just think that like the fact that America is the bar for us makes us aim so much lower than we should be aiming. And like it is insane to me that it had never occurred to me to put water rights in the Constitution. Like, yes, I want that tomorrow. I didn't even know you could do that. That's we should.
Right.
Why are they not already in there? That's like, I read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for our last episode, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool, robust document. And now that you've brought up the fact that there's no right to clean drinking water, I'm like, why wasn't that number one? Like, that's crazy
Right.
that it's not in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that 100% agree. I think I would love to see a more broad and globally minded Canada. I think of myself as a broad and globally minded person, not just because I am multi ethnic from all over the world, but I just like I enjoy other cultures, and I think that the rest of the world has a lot to offer. And it frustrates me immensely that like we always look to America as the standard and the model for everything that we do. I think we should be looking all over the world because there's good parts about everywhere. So yeah, I think that's a really really good point. And I think we'll leave it there. We'll get into our media recommendations unless you have anything else you want to add.
Nah, we good. Let's go.
All right. So what do you got this week?
Um, I mean, this is maybe more of a story, but I recently found out that, in fact, at the SZA Kendrick concert that I attended, I was
Amazing.
being a
Congratulations.
normal. Thank you. I was being a normal person and reading SZA's Wikipedia article at the concert, and that is how I found out that her and Drake used to date. And then I
Yeah.
Yes, and then I was like, "Oh damn, all of these like SZA Kendrick songs just got like so much better." And then also like so much weight was like added to like all of Kendrick's songs about Drake because I was like, "Oh, he knows what he's talking about. He's friends
He
with like his ex." Like,
he definitely
like
knows.
yes. So my rec is if for those of you who may not have been aware that SZA and Drake used to date, SZA and Kendrick are like besties, and so she definitely has been feeding him info for his diss tracks.
Oh, I'm sure that's where he got it from. That's correct. I didn't even know. I didn't think about that. Like I knew that they hung out, but that's great. I love that. Yeah, no, that's my recommendation for this week. I did not prepare one, but a thing that I am rewatching right now. I watched it as a child. This is embarrassing, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway. Are you familiar with the show Inuyasha?
Oh
It's an
yeah, for
it's an
sure.
anime.
Hmm.
I loved Inuyasha as a kid when it was on Teletoon. I don't remember which channel it was, but it was like one of those anime that we got in the like early 2000s on TV
Hmm.
dubbed in English. And I was kind of a voracious anime fan, so I watched whatever there was. And I was really into, like the feudal Japan big swords element of it. Now as an adult watching it, this show is Japanese Twilight. Like I don't think it's Twilight before Twilight,
Whoa.
and I didn't like register because I was like a young boy, and I just kind of ignored the like whole romance element of this show that like is actually like a huge central theme of the show. But I was like, I'm just in it for the swords and the demons, man. And now as an adult, I'm like, it's a pretty problematic love story, honestly. Like he was sealed to a tree for 50 years, so he's like an 80-year-old man. Although to be fair, I think if you're in a coma for 50 years, you're not really an 80-year, but still, he's like an adult. And the main girl is like 15, which is weird. But I do think that it doesn't get enough credit for being Twilight before Twilight because there's a whole love triangle between like two supernatural creatures like fighting over this girl, and she like can't decide which one of them to be in love with.
Whoa.
And it's pretty corny. And so I think that if you are into corny Japanese period romances with demons and giant swords and like a real like lots of like flowy long white hair. If you're into any of that, I would recommend that you watch Inuyasha.
Wow. That is Twilight before Twilight. Hectic.
Right? I didn't see it when I was a kid. I was like, I'm honestly just here for the
For the
demons and the
swords.
swords. But
Yeah.
now as an adult, I'm like, oh, I can't believe this is like a really big part of this show.
Oh, kids.
That's my recommendation for the week. If that's up your alley, check it out. All right, that's it for us this week. Huge thank you to Patricia for sharing her time and her thoughts with us yet again. Huge thank you to Suz Jazz Paris, as always, for allowing us to use his music. And thank you, listener, for listening. If you liked what you heard this week, please don't forget to like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, tell your friends, start a mega church and evangelize in my name. Whatever feels right to you. Until next week, I've been Andrew, and you have been listening to the Bad Eye Podcast. Be easy, y'all.